we on this stage have all been talking about that very issue for a very long time. You know, a couple of days ago, I was walking down Spark Street in Ottawa, and I ran into first Kevin Lynch, the former clerk of the Privy Council, and then I ran into Senator Peter Harder, who is was a deputy minister of a couple of departments with his hands on levers to do with productivity. And then I met for the first time Elizabeth Cannon, who is the president of the University of Calgary, also deeply involved in these questions of productivity for decades. Like between the three of those, more than 100 years of experience thinking about this very question. However, here we are, still with this problem, and it's probably it's looking worse than it did even even 10 years ago or 20 years ago, despite all the talk. So Trevor, I want to start with you. I think for a couple of decades anyway, we in all this conversation about productivity, there's been another side of the story, which is life in Canada is excellent. It's the best in the world, and let's just be grateful for that and appreciate that, and stop fretting about this other thing called productivity. The conversation has changed, and there's an urgency, and I would like to hear from you. Is it different this time, and why?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Canada's had a productivity challenge for many decades, as you note, and part of that is because we're a smaller country in terms of population, but a very large country in terms of geography. So there are always these frictions to even just trading goods and services with each other, and so that's going to come with some productivity consequences. But what makes this moment different, very different, is I think three things. First, the scale of the challenge has reached levels that we haven't seen in a very long time, and the speed at which our situation is worsening is also something that we haven't seen in a very long time. And then third, combined that with the importance of addressing it because of uncertainties in the world, that makes this moment new. So I'll unpack some of that. So when I say the scale of the challenge, I think we just heard from the OECD. So they measure hourly value that workers produce in a comparable way across countries. And if you look at where Canada ranks compared to others, we're about 30% by their numbers below the United States. But it's not just us versus the United States. We're about 10%, nearly 10% below the Euro area, and similarly below the United Kingdom, about 15% below the G7. Canada's overall productivity today compares most closely with Spain as any other country. And Spain's a great country as well, don't get me wrong, but when you think about dynamic, vibrant economies, high productivity and strong growth, you don't think of Spain. So keep that in mind. And here we are in Ontario. In the North American context, the amount produced here per person in Ontario is comparable to Alabama. Right? That is the closest comparable North American economy to this particular province. So we have a large challenge in terms of where we could be just by looking at where others are today and where Canada is in terms of the amount of economic activity that we generate. And it's worsening at a speed that is, I'd say, unexpected. If we go back several years ago, we wouldn't have guessed that we would have had lower productivity at the end of 2023 than we did a year earlier, which was lower than it was a year before that, lower today than where we were at the end of 2019, even prior to the pandemic. And the Bank of Canada, even just yesterday, in the Monetary Policy Report, anticipates labor productivity falling yet again in 2024. And so the challenge is growing, and growing very quickly. And we shouldn't just think about this as an abstract economic concept either. Productivity in terms of value per hour that we generate doesn't sound like it matters to your everyday life, but it does, as Ed noted and others have, it connects directly to the purchasing power of our income. How much are we compensated for each hour that we work? How much stuff can we purchase with each hour that we work? And in terms of disposable income that we see in Canada per person, that's effectively stagnant. It's grown by less than 2% over the past 8 years.
In real terms.
In real terms. And productivity, similarly, has grown less than 2% over that 8-year period. And Canada's never seen, over an 8-year period, slower labor productivity growth than we are seeing now, at any point since we started collecting this data in a comparable way since 1946. And disposable incomes now are growing more slowly than only 2 other moments in Canadian history: the Great Depression, which is kind of in a class of its own, and the 1990s recession, which was a deep and long-lasting slump in economic activity in Canada. So we're seeing that again, and it's not due to inflation. We had stronger real disposable income growth in the 70s and early 80s. Right? And it's not because of a recession. Right? The labor market, unemployment could be better, but we're not in a recession right now. So we're seeing the consequences of low productivity growth in terms of the living standards of everyday Canadians. And then third, the final point about what makes this moment different is the global environment that we're operating in. There's a huge amount of uncertainties, massive realignments in economic activity, China-US trade war, Brexit, for example, and our ability to have a resilient economy in the face of potentially large negative shocks abroad depends on our economy performing as strongly as it can, and that means high productivity. So the scale of the challenge, the speed of it worsening, and the importance of addressing it are now bigger than in most of our lifetimes.
Okay, thanks, Carolyn. I'm hoping you can pick up on that, in particular the global competitiveness and geopolitical aspect of it. You know, are you also seized with the urgency of the moment? I mean, clearly you've been focusing on productivity issues and growth for forever and ever. But where does the urgency come from for you? And can you now that you have a vantage point a little bit from outside the country, can you talk to us a bit about how geopolitical risk feeds into all of that?
Sure. I mean, I think the sense of urgency starts with what Trevor just said. But I would add geopolitical situation plus the other forces that are affecting not only the Canadian economy but others. And so those are the three factors that I think really mean that now is the moment. When you think that we're starting from a point of weakness, we're starting from a point where we're actually going backwards, that's going to turn on some red lights. But if the context that we're in, which is the one we're in, where we have geopolitical tensions, we have COVID waking up many, many countries, including those in the G7, saying, you know what, we need to rethink our supply chains to reduce our dependency on single points of failure, but also single points of failure in areas of the world that are facing these geopolitical risks. This causes, in my mind, several dynamics that are really headwinds to Canada and other countries. I'm going to talk about the opportunities too, but let's start with the headwinds. You know, obviously there's geopolitical ones, there's national security, but there's also the idea that if we want to rejig supply chains that were working very efficiently but weren't resilient, that means they're going to be more costly. That means we need to build our own supply chains in a way that makes up for those losses in efficiency. If you thought it was best to get inputs from, say, China and Taiwan in, say, chips, for example, because that's where they are, well, you're going to have to find a new source, and you're going to have to build that. And you're going to have to build it in a way that's more efficient. And countries are doing that. If you look at the U.S. with their CHIPS Act, with their Inflation Reduction Act, it's all about building capacity in the U.S. and finding partners. Janet Yellen, the Secretary Treasurer, calls it friendshoring. That's happening now, and those are investment mandates that are happening now that are going to be there for 10 to 15 years. And so if we miss that boat, Canada does, being part of that, we just miss that boat for not just tomorrow or the next day, but for many years. And so there's the opportunity. We've got critical minerals, we've got energy, we've got people, I could just spend the next 5 minutes or half an hour talking about what we've got, but it needs to be developed and enabled. The workers in that area, the businesses in those areas, and again, you can see from the numbers that we're not starting from a point of strength there. I think the second thing is that this isn't the only, geopolitical forces aren't the only things that we're up against. We're up against demographic change, which will put an incredible burden on the next generation, lots of costs for healthcare. We've got climate change that we need to prepare for and react to, and we've got digitalization, AI, and all the rest that is a challenge, but it's also a huge opportunity. And if we're going to be able to afford all the investments that are needed to meet those challenges, we need to raise our game in terms of productivity. And you know, Ed said, well, we're going to stay here in the room until we fixed it. Well, I hope we have a lot of pizza, because these are long-term issues that will take forever and ever. So the last sense of urgency to me is that if something requires massive long-term investments where you need to attract domestic capital and international capital to do it, you need to start now. and you need to have an environment where people, the private sector, want to engage. And I think we owe it to Canadians to kind of get on it.
Thanks. So Kaylie, take us domestically a little bit more. You're looking at the labor market quite closely, and I think the structure of our economy has changed over time. We've been heavily goods producing in the past. The mix is now more focused on services. How does that fit into our view of productivity or what's happening before us, and does it make the situation any more urgent?
Yeah, well, I think I want to start with saying, thinking about the urgency of the situation, I also feel a sense of urgency. And part of it is that we need to make sure we're growing productivity. And the other part is to make sure we don't forget about the purpose of creating or growing productivity, which is improving our quality of life. I worry and kind of panic about the idea that we might forget about improving quality of life in the approach to how we produce productivity. And so we need to make sure that we're centered around people. And we could be, say, looking at something like the US, a country like the US that's produced a lot of productivity, created more productivity, and also tremendous wealth and income inequality, poverty, those sorts of things. So let's make sure we're going in a direction, playing a longer game instead of a short game to get to where we want to go. Now, thinking about the services sector, the question that you asked, thinking about the services sector, there's a lot of parts of the services sector that maybe just don't produce as much GDP in the way that we use that then to measure productivity. Healthcare is one example I think about. If we compare Canada's healthcare system to the US healthcare system by the GDP per hour worked, the US healthcare system probably produces or is more productive. The Canadian system produces better health outcomes. We're going to need more healthcare over time for these demographic changes, and we need to make sure that we're not moving towards a system that looks to be more productive, but in fact is just creating more wealth for a certain group of people, more expensive healthcare, and more health poverty in another circumstance. So we need to make sure that we're keeping all of these pieces in mind. Another sector that I think about a lot is the childcare sector, and how, again, doesn't produce a lot of direct productivity, but enables productivity. So if you think about, there's the childcare workers who are producing childcare, then there's the parents who are able to go to work and produce GDP, and then there's also the kids who are going to be the productive agents of the future, and they're getting that investment right up front. And that doesn't, it's actually a bit of a drag on productivity in the way we calculate it, but in fact grows productivity in the long term. And it's a complicated measurement that we need to make sure we're considering in this conversation, so we're playing this longer game and not a short game.
Okay, except I know we're going to do another round here, but I just
Yeah.
I'll just pick up on that. So we've done all these things, invested in healthcare compared to the United States anyway. We invested in childcare. We've said this, and yet as Trevor said, our productivity numbers are in the tank and getting worse rapidly. So is it a delivery issue? What's going on there?
I think that having healthcare, having childcare, having these infrastructure pieces in place is necessary, but perhaps not sufficient. And I don't want to throw out these pieces that are necessary in order to get to a place where we have this higher productivity number that's sort of artificially created by a numbers game.
Okay, fair enough. So Dan, you have not had to live through our productivity nightmare, but you've seen Ireland's up close, and they're on the other side of this. Do you share, or if you were here with us, would you share the sense of urgency, or what kind of wisdom can you give to us coming from the outside?
Great, thank you. First of all, let me thank the organisers for the invitation. It's fantastic to be back in Canada. It's been a couple of decades, and certainly walking around outside, it feels more like one of those high-growth East Asian cities. The amount of construction that's going on here is a very different kind of feel from outside from the conversation. But it's absolutely correct. There's no doubt the data are showing that for the past 10 years, Canada has had a problem with productivity growth. and very low investment in the things that bridges, infrastructure, capital equipment for companies. There's clearly a problem there for the past 10 years. So I suppose the organizers asked me, are there lessons from my country and my continent that I could possibly share with you that might help in boosting productivity growth and capital spending? So I'd preface it by saying that there is no magic bullet. Productivity growth is a very complicated issue. As the speaker from the OECD said earlier on, there's been a downward trend in productivity growth in the rich world over decades. And that is something that is not well understood, and it's happening despite the IT revolution. So I think it's important to say there are no magic bullets. But let me give two starting points. One is from Italy, and one is from my own country. So Italy has had an investment problem, not for 10 years, for 25 years. And it's got a lot more serious other problems than Canada. So Italy has had real problems for a quarter of a century. Since the pandemic, there's been this sudden increase in capital spending. Now, the only thing I can see to explain that, after 25 years of basic flatlining in capital spending, you have this 30% increase. Astonishing. So the only thing that really changed is the European Union decided during the pandemic to borrow a lot of extra money and channel it to the weaker countries like Italy. So that raises the question, and we'll have to see whether this extra spending on investment in Italy actually shows up in the productivity figures. But if that's worked out, then does Canada want to think about a major boost in its government capital spending, both in public investment and in subsidies to businesses? So I think watching what happens in Italy is something that would be well worth Canada's time in doing. Second point from my own country, Ireland. So corporation tax is viewed as being, low corporation tax is viewed as being one of the pillars of Ireland's transformation from being the poorest country in Northwest Europe to being one of the richest and most successful economically. So we've had a low corporation tax that all of the political parties agree with, that is totemic in Irish politics, and anyone who challenges it will be almost accused of treason. Businesses know that. There has been a lot of inward investment on the back of it, domestic investment. Canada's about the middle amongst the OECD big G7 countries, about the big middle of the pack when it comes to corporation tax. Does Canada want to think about cutting profit taxes significantly and having political agreement across the spectrum that they are going to stay low forever? Is that something that might work? I'm not saying, again, that is a magic bullet or it's guaranteed to work, but it's certainly worked for us. Thank you.
Okay, we are very far from that kind of collaboration in Canada, just saying. So let's mix it up a little bit. Just I hope you'll all feel free to jump in to some questions here. So Dan, you talked about Italy enjoying this big explosion of investment post-pandemic, and I wonder. So you know, the pandemic I feel like it has a very long tail. That there are so many changes in our economy. We were supposed to build back better, and it certainly did change a lot of things. Building back better, on the other hand, seems to be exactly the opposite of what we're talking about here. So why do you think it is that we in Canada are not seeing that same kind of explosion of capital? We've got a lot of government spending. We've got a lot of talk about, battery supply chains and electric vehicles and clean transition and all of those things. But we're still seeing this huge drag in productivity. So, does the pandemic and how we handled it and how we're recovering from it have anything to do with that? And are we not able to build back better because we did something wrong there?
It certainly, from the outside, and not being a specialist in Canada, it certainly doesn't seem that it's the post-pandemic options that Canada's taken, because the problem really seems to start in 2014, and obviously everyone here knows infinitely more than I ever will about the Canadian economy. But what really looks odd when you look at the data compared to the other big economies in Europe, the France, Germany, UK, US, is what happened here in 2014, where investments suddenly started to, investment in capital dropped, and that was so unusual. So it seems to me it's the 2014-2019 period that makes Canada look very unusual, less so the post-pandemic period. Although, as you say, we'll be looking at the pandemic and the responses for decades before we know.
Yeah, Trevor?
Yeah, so maybe I'll pick up there, and actually saw one of the Q&As was related to this as well, about the role that the resource sector plays in explaining some of the lagging productivity growth over the past 8 years in Canada. And that's certainly a part, a drop in oil prices that we saw starting in late 2014, continuing through for 2 years, reaching incredible lows in 2016, led investment in that sector to fall off a cliff. And that was a very large sector, accounting for the bulk of real investment in Canada. It's the #1 export sector as well. And there was just the drop then, but the outlook for oil prices going forward led firms to reevaluate where they think we were headed decades down the line. And so investment falling there means that the new oil sands in particular, new constructions or expansions were ceased. And that's a big part of it. Now, estimates around how much the oil prices at that time would have shrank Canada's overall economy, estimates do vary, and researchers will be looking back at this moment in time to unpack all the different contributing factors. But the best estimates I've seen are that drop in oil prices would have shrank Canada's aggregate economy by about 2%, which is considerable. Don't get me wrong, considerable. But if you look at where our economy is today compared to where it would have been today had we just kept pace with the United States, we'd be about 13% larger than we are now. So yeah, the drop in oil prices is a part of it, a measurable part of it, but it is not the dominant explanatory factor here behind Canada's low productivity performance.
Carolyn, did you want to add to that?
So it seems to me that that the energy sector and the desire to reduce our carbon footprint are intertwined here. And even when you get outside the energy sector and you think about our other strengths in terms of where our net exports, positive net exports come from, you can add in agriculture and mining, among others. But those are like the top three. And to advance there and to invest there, you also need to have a regulatory environment, a project approval or investment plan that has a fair degree of certainty and can be brought to fruition in a finite timeline. And what you see, and I don't know if it got worse after 2014 or before, but what you see is that there's this big need in these areas for major investments in infrastructure and in technology, but there's a huge uncertainty about what the payoff over what timeline is going to be. And so I think that the oil price shock didn't help, but certainly for investment in those areas, and I would add, it's housing is another area where the regulatory environment, productivity is pretty low in the housing sector, but the common element here is really, in part, the regulatory environment, which covers many levels of government that need to coordinate many processes, and some of them are meeting social objectives, and so that's fine, but some of them may not be. They might not actually yield net benefits. I saw a question there about the role of Indigenous communities and their lower wages or incomes that they earn, and I was just thinking that part of the solution that was probably talked about in the first session, which unfortunately I missed, is actually not so much about regulation, that's part of it, but the other part is how do we engage with Indigenous communities to bring them onto projects using a model that means they go faster, but also communities are respected, get some financial gain from it, and the projects move along. I think those are the two elements that I would focus on for Canada in those areas.
So if I could just push back a little bit, though, that conversation is vibrant. In Canada, there are a lot of policy solutions that are in the air anyway about equity and economic reconciliation and red tape and how much of it do we have and regulation and looking at it in all sorts. It's not just oil and gas. It's clean transition. It's also pharmaceuticals. It's also housing, as you say. It's all over the place. Like we seem to have this obsession with adding more, even as we talk continually about taking it away and streamlining it. What is going on there?
Well, I mean, there's legitimate reasons. I'm a regulator, so on the financial side with the Bank of England, so this reflects my ideas and not theirs. But as a regulator, I can say that the intent is always good. But as one, I can also say that the outcome isn't always what you'd hope for, and so it's incumbent on the regulators and the lawmakers to think through what's actually adding value here, serving society well, and what can be just dumped and streamlined. And to say that it's just too complicated and is impossible is not correct, because other countries get projects done faster, they get them done in a collaborative way, and they also have outside advice through either agencies, think about Germany or Denmark, just as two examples where they get experts on the ground who actually understand the regulations and their effects to provide advice on where to make the best changes. And so I think it's definitely possible. It's hard, but it's a big, to me, it's a big part of the problem that we have. Not the only part, but a big part.
Do you have a question about that? Or? Okay.
No, I was gonna turn to you because I do want to. I want to know about the pandemic. During the pandemic, I thought, when so many people were off work, and we still needed to keep an economy functioning. I thought we were going to be on. I thought it was going to be, like an epiphany in productivity at that point, because I thought companies were going to go in there and make up for having all their employees at home by investing heavily in capital and basically robotics and artificial intelligence and digitization and whatever it takes to keep things going. And then I thought we would be on the other side of it, that everybody would come back to work and have all these great computers and digital aids to help them produce a lot more with the same amount of money. But has that happened?
No.
That was a leading question. Loaded
Short
question.
answer. Thinking about this question and the previous question, what's different in Canada than, say, in the United States, or hearing about all the investment that's gone into Italy lately, my hope through the pandemic and after was that we would build back better. Unifor wrote this great paper about building a resilient, equitable economy and how that would function in order to have a more productive economy as well. We won a few very, very small pieces of that. What we saw was perhaps what we need is a stronger employment insurance system. So if someone loses their job, they can have the income they need to go back to school, to learn how to use the technologies that are coming down the pipe, to learn how to create the technologies that should be coming down the pipe. And instead, we starve those systems, as one example. So I thought we would be learning lessons to build back better, and we're kind of limited by the discourse in the country that says government can't spend too much money because it's going to cause too much inflation, and we know that inflation was caused by other things. Thinking about technology being adopted in particular sectors, what we see on the ground when I'm talking to our members across the country is they are not considered when technology is developed or adopted by their employer. So if we think of large customer service companies, as one example, what the system that is being adopted creates is frustration for everybody. The customer service representative is unable to actually produce a satisfactory experience. You're online, you can't find the phone number, you have to use a chat bot, then you go to AI, AI directs you to someone, AI has misunderstood what your question is. It creates a system that is more miserable than it is actually productive.
You're giving me anxiety.
And what we need to be, how we need to be approaching technological change in order to create more productivity is actually talk to workers and consider them and involve them in the process right from the very beginning. And that's something that gets missed constantly. It is a little bit, there are some regulations that require some of that conversation, but it's more of a, hey, by the way, you're probably going to lose your job soon because we're going to try and implement this AI, not how can we have a system that enhances your productivity by providing you a piece of technology that will help you do your job better, provide you more autonomy, and make you a more productive person.
Okay, sorry, go ahead, Dan.
Can I?
Yes.
Okay, as an outsider, I'm a bit surprised how gloomy the conversation is. and can I just say, confidence is a vital part of investment. So if everyone is saying the world's about to end, they're not going to invest. So can I just push back a bit?
Yes.
Okay, because I get this in Europe a lot. Everywhere, I have to say to people, folks, things are bad, but let's just look at some of the positive things. Now, as I look at Canada compared to the other G7 countries, I would think you're fundamentally right now stronger than the UK, Germany, and certainly Italy, okay? Now, that doesn't mean that, US has clearly done much better. Whether that's sustainable or not, we'll see. But it just looks to me from the outside that Canada's got a lot of fundamental strengths. You've globalized very well, better than most other G7 countries. You've got a fantastic skilled labor force, for example, so you've got a lot of strengths. And let's also remember, okay, New Year's Eve 2019, if anyone told you that over the next 4 years you'd have a pandemic, lockdowns, brutal inflation, interest rates going crazy, and for us in Europe in particular, the war, I would have said that we'd be in a global depression. So things are actually, let's not talk ourselves into too much gloom and doom.
Okay, so on that note, let's turn to solutions because, okay, so we've got a few minutes left and Ed has kind of jinxed the whole thing here by telling us we can't leave until we have solutions, but we will try, and we have the benefit of being the first panel so we can just start that conversation and everybody else can finish it. I want to know concretely, because you have all been thinking hard about this for years, like tell me the very, very solid things, and not just government. We have, I think, a tendency in Canada to constantly turn towards government. They're obviously a huge part of the picture, but it's not the whole picture. So concretely, what can we do? What are the practical solutions to take this urgency, the new understanding that we have in productivity, the new zone that we're working in post-pandemic with all these crises that Dan just mentioned, and what do we do with that to make it better? Okay, Trevor, you're first.
Great. So, long list, and as we noted before, this is not a new challenge for Canada, so we've been thinking about ways of boosting productivity for some time, but right now, given the scale and urgency of us addressing it, I think we need to go back and rethink some of these older ideas. And I'm going to, I guess, first put forward one that is probably going to be, I think, meaningful, but perhaps the most boring suggestion anyone is going to make at all today in this room, and that is to recognize that Canada's an incredibly decentralized country, right? Depending on the measure you have in mind, we might be the most decentralized country of any where the OECD collects this kind of fiscal federalism data on. Provinces are incredibly important. And part of the productivity challenge that we have in Canada is that we don't have a lot of coordination across governments. And it's not unique to our current situation. The federal government has political incentives to play off of provinces. Provincial governments, premiers have the same incentive. I'm from Alberta, and that seems to be the dominant strategy of everything motivating the Alberta government, just inflame and ratchet up those tensions. But what we need is something to better coordinate decisions, regulatory decisions in particular, across jurisdictions. It's the most important source of interprovincial trade costs, the fact that just regulations differ from one province to the next. It's a huge barrier to labor mobility, allowing people to move to where their skills are most valuably employed. If their credentials are not recognized in one province, it's very difficult for them to move to another job if they have to recertify or go through an examination procedure and so on. And so perhaps we need to think about creating a new kind of arm's length independent agency, kind of what we do with the Parliamentary Budget Office that calls out fiscal decisions of government. We need to have something like a National Productivity Council. And you might think, oh, Trevor just made up that name. No, we used to have a National Productivity Council, and its job would be to point at different issues that were economically challenging for Canada. Its name changed. It became the Economic Council of Canada later on. So something like that puts productivity center stage, something that's independent of government, answerable to Parliament or some other kind of structure, to call out decisions that governments take that make matters worse. And I guess that's the final thing I'll note. I know I'm talking too long, but we should stop making things worse with choices that we make. We need to put productivity considerations at the center of our policy-making decisions. And so things like an oil and gas emissions cap, for example, something where it would not be an advisable climate policy. And anyone thinking about first principles, right, it is there. They don't let me out of Alberta unless I critique the oil and gas emissions cap. But seriously, that's the type of policy that is not necessary to achieve an objective and comes with incredibly large economic costs that is detrimental to our productivity growth.
Okay, Carolyn, your best solution. Practical.
Well, I'm going to build on the interprovincial stuff. I mean, to me, there's so many levels of government and so many different regulations that the provinces need to get together and figure out how to streamline. There's something in the regulatory world with cross-border regulation where you pick a lead regulator and then everybody else just trusts them, make sure that, and so if the lead regulator says it's fine, they don't have to redo everything. I know banks here might not think that it's as streamlined as that, but it could be a lot worse. And there's just so many areas that cause interprovincial barriers to trade in people and in goods that reduce our productivity, that reduce our incomes. There's also a lot of red tape that increases timelines. So that's like top of my list. Second is we need an infrastructure plan. And we need a long-term infrastructure plan that sets priorities and finds public, internal and external to Canada capital to invest in that. And when we do it, we need to think big projects because that's where the money is going to channel to if we want to attract it to Canada. And it has to have some regulatory certainty. And we don't have that. Australia has a productivity council. They also have an infrastructure agency that is really good at, it's an independent agency that's really good at thinking, sifting through projects and making capacity calls and thinking about priorities. Maybe it's not exactly the right model, but there are models out there. And I think the final thing I would do is have this call to action that we're trying to build. When Canadians say they want something, it usually happens. It happened in the 90s when the budget issue, the debt was such an issue, Canadians were on board to get that fixed. We need Canadians to want this just as much as people in this room do. And I think the more that we can all do to get that call to action, I know the Coalition for a Better Future is working on that as well. The Business Council of Canada, we all need to get that on the agenda as a priority and act.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for the shout out. Kaylie, what's your best answer?
I have three. One is industrial strategy. So building on infrastructure strategy, let's talk about industrial strategies and growing specific industries in particular ways to focus on good jobs, high wages for people who are working in those jobs, developing the technology that's needed, and in a focused way that brings all the stakeholders together. Number two is thinking about a high wage strategy. So one thing that I thought would happen after the pandemic is we had this sort of labor crunch that would then lead employers and companies to improve and use tools to increase productivity. And instead, what we've done is go with this low wage strategy that tries to attract people in a different way. I think we could have done a lot better in that circumstance. And one item that hasn't come up at all that I thought would is competition policy and corporate concentration. I wouldn't so much focus on corporate concentration as I would on bad behavior, regardless of the size of your market share. But dealing with abuses of dominance and things that maybe increase profit and confuse profit with productivity is another thing that I would do.
Interesting. I like your distinction. Dan, okay, yeah, what would you advise us to do?
So two things, picking up on what other speakers have said, and one thing from my own country. So that we have a National Productivity Council in Ireland. It certainly helps. It keeps the issue on the agenda. They issue regular reports and it gets it into the media and it gets the national conversation going. It certainly does no harm. It probably helps a little. So I'd echo that. In terms of competition policy, European Union, in my views, one of the positive things the European Union has done is being the competition function is centralized in Brussels to a large extent. And that has been extremely important, not only in intra-European competition, but also making sure that larger foreign companies don't do anti-competitive things, and it often prevents, for example, mergers of American companies because European regulators think it will damage European consumers. So I think that's been another positive. It's not something you can replicate here, but it's just been another, the issue of competition is very important. And the final one, success in my country, we get many things wrong, but one thing we've done well, we have absolutely crushed high school dropout rates, okay? Now that is not going to transform the productivity picture, okay? It will help a little at best, but it's a really important aspect, as socially as much as economically. High school dropouts, you know, mountain of evidence saying high school dropout is a bad thing for people and for their lifelong productivity and their lifelong earnings. So focusing on that and trying to bring down high school dropouts is certainly something that is not only good for society, but can help productivity as well.
Okay, I think we have time for a couple of questions, I believe. And if I'm wrong, somebody's going to tell me that, right? So yes, okay, good. We've got a few minutes. Okay, so let's take our first question. If the major challenge to overall productivity is business productivity, and the overall tone of our politics are anti-business, how do we overcome that? And I'm going to combine that with the second question because I think, you know, if our politics are anti-big business, they're not anti-small business, and we've got a lot of small businesses. So, you know, how much of our productivity challenge is related to that? You know, huge appreciation for small businesses, not so much for the very productive big businesses. And how do we take one and turn it into the other? Who wants to answer that?
I have something on small businesses. That's okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So you know, it's interesting. You quite rightly said that scale is an issue for Canada, Trevor. But even if you look, you control for that, and you just look at the productivity of small, medium-sized enterprises, it's also lower than comparators in the U.S. because there's lower adoption of technology, and there's lower investment in workers, and it's really hard for small businesses to adopt and to train workers. And so I think that you know, programs that enable small businesses to figure out how they can manage their production or their services while they're training workers, and they might lose the ones they've trained, or how do they invest in new technology when they don't have the capital budget for it, or maybe even the in-house knowledge about how actually to do that and what the benefit would be. These are huge opportunities for small and medium-sized enterprises. And if you add into that fixing the financing ability of small SMEs to scale, I think we'd have a very vibrant area because, you know, this is the employer for many, many Canadians, and I agree with you entirely. This is an area, aside from our big global winners, where there's so much hope, and it's frustrating to see that more isn't being done there, but it is a place of hope.
Okay, go ahead, Kaylie.
I'm just adding on to that, thinking about training for workers. We talk a lot about transitions, and the transitions, you can think about it as a just transition, you can think about other transitions that are happening, making sure that government is providing the transition supports, whether you're being replaced or you need to find a new job, or there's training that's required in order to keep your job if technology has changed. And those pieces I don't think exist right now. In the auto sector, we're working on it. We are going through transition right now in the auto sector, moving from ICE vehicles to EVs. There is quite a bit of training that's going on. It doesn't get talked about a lot, but there is quite a bit of training that's going on to train up the folks who are working on the assembly line to use the next piece of technology. And that's something that we could be looking towards and replicating for the future, thinking about the energy sector as well and the transition that's happening towards more green energy, what it means to be using the skills that exist and then training for the skills that we need as well, and what sort of government support comes with that program.
Okay, we have just one last round here. We've got to be very quick, but there's a question here about corporate leadership and how much of a role does that play in our collective drag, and particularly as it pertains to implementing or adapting AI and artificial intelligence. And there's going to be a whole panel on this later. So let's we can just give our headline answers, and we'll dig a little bit later. Go ahead, Dan.
Okay, an anecdote. I have a friend who runs a small, medium-sized company. He had 4 people in his marketing department. This time last year, we had a conversation. He laid off 3 of them. 1 person is doing the work. 4 people, thanks to AI. So that's just my anecdote from one business leader.
Okay, that's a pretty brutal anecdote for the people side of things.
I'd heard a lot of chat about it, no pun intended, and then when he told me that, then I sort of started paying attention.
Yeah, that's shocking.
Thinking about AI, adopting all these new technologies, we need to make sure that it's a human-centered approach. It's far more complicated than one sentence to do it well, but we need to make sure we're keeping people at the center of that technology in everything that we do.
Trevor?
Well, businesses and business leaders in response to the question will, like all of us, respond to incentives that exist in the environments that they're working in, right? The structure of the markets, but policies in particular. So adopting new technologies, that requires investment. And we do have a tax structure that disincentivizes investment in lots of sectors. Right? The federal government does some really nice calculations on what's the share of each dollar in new investment that we effectively tax, the marginal effective tax rate. And in sectors like construction, it's a little over 20%. So if you invest $1, 20% of that is effectively taxed. In wholesale trade, 22%. Services as a whole, 25%. And so if we see less adoption, less investment in terms of machinery and equipment and new technologies, it's in part because there is a high tax rate that we levy on investment in Canada.
Okay, thank you so much for your ideas. And hopefully that starts, I've got a pretty robust list of things we can do to solve this problem, Ed. We're on it. And it's not complete though, so you have the rest of the day. Thank you so much.